New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the fascinating life and career of Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who is one of the founders of the Theosophical Society, one of the most colorful, fascinating characters of the 19th century. My guest is Gary Lachman, esoteric historian. He is the author of Madame Blavatsky, the Mother of Modern Spirituality. He is also author of some 20 other books dealing with major trends and themes and personalities in the field of esoteric history. He's written about Rudolf Steiner, Aleister Crowley, P.D. Ouspensky, Swedenborg, Jung, Colin Wilson. He's written extensively on politics and the occult. And I'm very pleased to have him with me today via Skype. So now I'll switch over to the Skype video. Welcome again, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you and to have this discussion about a person who has fascinated me for many, many decades. As someone who was sort of immersed in the California New Age culture, I'm very much aware of the enormous debt that those of us who participated in that culture, for better or worse, owe to Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement. It's just extraordinary to me how many concepts originated with her.
Oh, absolutely. And as always, it's a pleasure to be on. No, she's one of the most remarkable women of, well, I'd say the 19th century, but practically any time. And not only because of the Theosophical Society, which, of course, was very, very influential. And as I say in my book, it's the subtitle of the book, Madame Blavatsky, the Mother of Modern Spirituality, because I think she's the one who more or less got what we consider to be sort of spirituality today kind of going with the Theosophical Society back in the 1870s in New York.
Supposedly, at least her origins, and I mean by that her esoteric spiritual origins are as you confess in your book, still quite mysterious.
Well, her background is, as the cliche goes, shrouded in mystery. A great deal of which she went out of her way to produce. But the general story is that she was born in Russia, in Ekaterinburg, in 1831. And when she was about 17, she was married off to an older man. He was in his 40s, but he was considered aged, I guess, at the time. And the marriage was never consummated. And what Blavatsky did was she ran off once in search of the unknown, which is what she says. And as a young girl, she says that she had discovered her great-grandfather's occult library, Prince Pavel Dolgoruki, who was involved with sort of Rosicrucian Freemasonry in the 18th century in Russia, which is a fascinating subject in itself. And then she met other people in her childhood that spoke of sort of this kind of esoteric wisdom and the secret knowledge and things of that sort. And as soon as she could, she hightailed it from where she was in order to pursue this. And the story is that for some 20 years, she basically went around the globe. I mean, if you read about her life, she was everywhere from, Tibet to Mexico or Canada. She talks about going across the Midwest in a Conestoga wagon. She fought on the barricades with Mazzini in Italy against the papal troops. She was one of the survivors of the wreck of the Eudamia, which was apparently a big a maritime disaster that predated the Titanic. And this is just a few things. But in terms of corroborate, history that we can corroborate, she washes up in New York in 1873, and she's come across the Atlantic down like in third class, with all the immigrants. And the story is that she had a first class ticket. She came from sort of aristocratic family. Her grandmother was the daughter of a princess, and all that kind of thing. But just before she was going to take her first class berth, she saw a family in distress, and they were supposed to be traveling in steerage, and they had lost their tickets or something along their lines. And the story is that she went and cashed in her first class ticket and bought steerage tickets for herself and the family, and that's how she traveled across. And she appears in the Lower East Side of New York. It wasn't Ellis Island then. I think it was down at the Battery where people were sort of, brought into the country. And she winds up living in a sort of working women's hostel in the Lower East Side. And it's through basically, how she became who we know her as Madame Blavatsky, is that she heard of these. She was reading these articles written by Colonel Olcott, who sort of became her Plato to her Socrates, or kind of Abbott to her Costello, or something like that. And Olcott was covering a series of manifestations, a series of sort of spiritual manifestations and sightings up in I think it was up in Connecticut, if I recall correctly. And she basically went there in order to meet him and basically to capture him, seduce him, not in a sexual sense, because she thought sex was beastly. And she said throughout her life that she was celibate. But she seduced him in the sense that she got him to be sort of her kind of front man, more or less. And then he met her, and he was completely bowled over by her. And he starts writing about her in the newspapers. And that's how she becomes, Madame Blavatsky, the one that we know of.
I think it's fair to say that when she arrived in New York, I think in 1873, the American spiritualist movement was in its heyday.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And Blavatsky herself said to have conducted seances in Cairo and in Paris. And, in her search for secret wisdom, she had met and worked with different spiritualists and different mediums and so on. And certainly in the States, I guess 1848, the Fox sisters start up in sort of upstate New York. And by a few years later, there's a spiritualist craze across the whole country. That's went across the Atlantic over to Europe as well. And Blavatsky, but she quickly became kind of public enemy number one with the spiritualists, because she claimed that, one of the things she claimed was that the spirits that turn up at all these seances, they're not who they say they are. It's not Aunt Betty or, Uncle Tom or whoever it is, or Napoleon, whoever it is you're talking to. She more or less said these are sort of the hobos of the astral plane, these kind of sort of good-for-nothings who have nothing better to do than hang out and wait for somehow humans or us to come in contact with them because they enjoy the contact and they get something out of it and all that kind of thing. Or they're basically mischievous kind of entities who like pulling people's legs. And what she did when she met Olcott up at these seances where she met him was that the type and character of appearances, the type and character of manifestations suddenly changed. And where before it was sort of more local, kind of, American Indians or something like that, all these Russian people start turning up, all these sort of Ukraine or Cossacks sort of thing. And what she said to Olcott was that she was making it happen. Spirits, yeah, there were spirits. It's sort of like a count somebody or other or something like this would be speaking. And what she said to Olcott was that she was making it happen. Mm-hmm. So she wasn't a medium, she was a magician. And she had, unlike mediums who become kind of passive, mediums, they become passive media for the spirits to speak through. She had mastered her powers and she was in control.
Now, and the fact that she convinced Olcott that she had these powers, it certainly seems that way from his descriptions of what he observed. is due to a relationship that she believes she had at that time with individuals she described as hidden masters.
Yes, she talks about the Mahatmas. Originally they are the masters, and then when her interest shifted from ancient Western sort of Hermetic tradition to Eastern spirituality, they became Mahatmas, which just basically means great souls. But again, this notion of hidden masters, in the context, historically, it goes back to the kind of Freemasonry that her great-grandfather had been involved with. This was a sort of Freemasonry that was called strict observance. And it started up sometime in the 1750s and was an offshoot of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, but it was a much more esoteric, much more magical, mystical kind of Freemasonry. But it was called strict observance because the main rule was that you had to carry out without question and without change, commands given to you by hidden superiors, by people you did not know. You didn't know who they were, and if you ever had any contact with them, they were masked and all this sort of thing. And so this idea that there were these hidden figures, these unknown superiors in the world who had this hidden wisdom and were sort of basically directing things was something that, she claimed to have been aware of in her youth. And then it gets transformed into specific characters. She says that in 1851, again, there's this variety of stories about how she first meets the masters, and they change over time, and she tells them differently. And again, as I say in the book, there's no one story that you can point your finger to and say, this is the real one, but there's one that she tells more than others. And that one is that in 1851, when she was in London here, visiting the Great Exhibition. This was this fantastic kind of World's Fair at the time, and they had the Crystal Palace and a variety of different architectural and cultural kind of shows. And while she was there, this Hindu gentleman passed by, and she recognized him as the master, one of the masters whom she had met in dreams and had visions throughout her childhood. And they later met up, and he communicated to her that what she had to do was make her way to Tibet so that she could learn to master her occult powers. They have become aware of her, and they want to send her there so that she can become their emissary and return to the West and spread the message.
And in fact, as you report in your book, it seems likely that she was in Tibet.
Well, it's sort of like it's like Tibet, how something called Greater Tibet or Little Tibet. I think it's Ladakh, which is sort of an area that's nearby. And she claims to have been there. And she said she spent 7 years in Tibet, but not 7 consecutive years, and like in total and that kind of thing. But even if she didn't get actually into Lhasa, which she said, that didn't happen. But she said that she did reach the secret monastery that was connected to the Tashalumpa monastery, which is well known. But this was one where her masters weren't Tibetans; they were Hindus, but they operated. Their HQ, as it were, was in Tibet. And at this secret monastery, this is where she learned how to master her powers. And she made 3 attempts to get to Tibet. To get there, it was only in the 3rd one that she succeeded. Mm-hmm. And she tells that story, or that story is told in different books about her. But in the meantime, she traveled. She traveled around the world. She had these incredible adventures. I mean, she had a life to fill about 20 other people's lives. And I have to say, one of the things I mentioned in the book, and I say when I do talks about Madame Blavatsky, is I'm surprised that the feminists have never really grabbed onto her. Because I said she's one of the most remarkable women, ever. And I suspect the occult, stain has kept them away. It's disreputable. But even Annie Besant, who in her early career, she later became, one of the heads of, or the head of the Theosophical Society after Blavatsky. But in her early career, she was a feminist. She was a suffragette. She was concerned with a lot of social issues. But then when she met Blavatsky, she basically converted. But she's another figure who's very influential in the women's movement. You would think, well, if you can accept that Annie Besant became a Theosophist, you should certainly, take a look at Madame Blavatsky.
Well, in your book, you talk about after the founding of the Theosophical Society, they had publicly stated their vision, their goals for the organization. And the first of these, as I recall, was to help create a society of universal brotherhood where people would see each other as equals regardless of sex, race, color, caste, or the normal characteristics that separate people. So it would seem as if she was a great humanist from the get-go.
Oh, again, I mean, this is one of the things too. In a book, I say in my book about Blavatsky, and in another book called Politics and the Occult, I say that it's ironic that she's often sort of tagged as the source of a lot of far right or very conservative political views, but she was actually a humanist, a free-thinking humanist at the time. She rebelled against the church, the Christianity. She wasn't against religion. She didn't like Christianity or Judaism very much, but she was very much a free thinker. And celebrated, free thought and speculation and all of that sort of thing. And so, she was quite the radical, in her day. And exactly what you said, this whole idea of this brotherhood of man, regardless of race, creed, color, sex, income, anything like that. Again, that comes out of her Masonic roots, or the Masonic roots of her great grandfather, because that was one of the aims of Freemasonry, this brotherhood of man. And that's the one in many ways that, even though the other two was to sort of study the ancient teachings of the past and also to study, the world's religions and things of that sort. But this whole thing about this brotherhood of man, that was something that she actively, threw herself into her life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think she's also very closely identified with the notion of the hidden masters, and you point out that there's some origins there in her grandfather's Freemason activities, but it strikes me you can find it in the Hindu tradition as well. In the Bhagavad Gita, for example, Krishna, who is the avatar of the god Vishnu, appears to be just a charioteer.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, it's not an idea that's sort of exclusively Masonic, but I think in her own history and sort of the background when she was sort of first coming. Again, this is a story she tells. She first came across all this occult literature, and the whole idea of this hidden wisdom is associated with these people who had it, and they were out there. They were out there in Europe, and that's she wanted to go meet them. She wanted to go find them. She wasn't going to find exactly the ones that were spoken about in the book she read, but there were others out there. And that's the whole thing. The masters become a kind of, again, it's specific individuals who have that title, and then it becomes a kind of honor that she bestows upon people in her travels, the people who she's learned things from, the people who she shared adventures with, the people who shared experiences with. They're masters, they're kind of the seekers of truth. I mean, Gurdjieff, who's a generation or so after Madame Blavatsky, he has a similar kind of idea, this whole idea of the seekers of truth. This was a group of people in his book, Meetings with Remarkable Men. He talks about in his youth and as a young man, they journeyed through the Holy Lands in Egypt and Central Asia in search of these repositories of secret wisdom. And that, in many ways, he was following in the footsteps of Madame Blavatsky.
Well, there is a difference, I suppose, between a seeker of truth and a master who is well established in a hidden monastery somewhere and who has a school where people are taught to become highly developed psychics.
Yeah, well, the ones, Kuthumi and Moira were the specific individuals who were her actual masters, who she had, contact with. And one of the things that's different about Blavatsky's conception of the masters and how the idea got taken up by people after her, like Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater and some others, is that for her they were always flesh and blood people. And they're always on the same plane. They weren't ascended masters. They weren't existing in some, other dimension, and you can contact them. Even though she contacted them or they contacted her telepathically, they were on the other side of the planet. They weren't up in the ninth dimension or something like that. And she always maintained that these were actual people. And she said one of the reasons that she was always a bit protective about them and didn't want to talk about them too much and didn't want to actually bring it out into the public is that she had respect for them as people and individuals, and she didn't want to draw them into this whole kind of publicity thing about who are the masters and that kind of thing. And she even regretted later in life that she had ever brought them up, because it was something like people are naming their dogs Kuthumi now or something like that. It's sort of like this kind of thing that was a particular person got picked up and everybody's kind of using it in a way. But these were real people who they themselves had mastered their occult powers, had mastered their mind. I mean, fundamentally, she's saying that the mind is the final arbiter. The mind is the power over everything, and if you don't master your mind, you have no master of anything. This is why she was critical of mediumship and spiritualism, because for her it was giving over that control to someone else who could, or something else that would take over. She wanted to, not that she wanted to be in control, but to be a master. You had to be able to achieve that. And this was something that they did. She learned how to do. And when you start to read about her life and accounts of it, if, only, a fraction of it is true, she apparently was able to do some remarkable things. And so were they.
Let's discuss some of the examples that have been reported that witnesses claim they observed her do.
Well, I think one of the most well-known one is this sort of teleportation or manifestation, where something, she would make something appear, an apport or something like that. And one of the famous stories, the ones that kind of started her career in around the world, was when she was in India, and she had the journalist A.P. Sinnett had, who was an editor of the Pioneer. It was a big newspaper there, and people like Kipling had written for it. He became very, very interested in Blavatsky. He had heard about her, and he invited her to come and stay with him at his his estate, his home, and all that sort of thing. And there's a story that they were all going out. The whole party was all going out on a picnic. They were all going to have tea out in the jungle somewhere or something like that. And when they got to the point, the spot where they were going to have their tea, it came out that a teacup and a saucer was missing. There was one short. And almost a half joke, someone said, "Oh, Madame Blavatsky, couldn't you just sort of make one appear here for us now?" And she, "Oh no, please don't bother me with this." "Oh no," and they kept importuning her to do it, and so she finally agreed. And after she did whatever she did, she said, "Okay, look there," and they had to dig into the soil quite a bit, and there again, this is the story. They're kind of stuck behind roots, that have clearly weren't disturbed and put back in place, was a teacup and a saucer. And it was one that actually matched the set that was there. And subsequently they went back to see if she somehow had, surreptitiously, pocketed somehow a teacup and a saucer from the pantry and somehow had gone and dug into the earth and found it. But there's all circumstantial evidence to suggest, well, okay, but maybe if she did that, how could she possibly get it behind all these roots where, the roots had grown around the cup and the saucer? And how would she know that that's where they were going to go? She didn't decide on the itinerary. She didn't decide on where they were going to go to have the picnic. It was somebody else. And so that's sort of one of the big stories. And then she was known to do similar things just, in other circumstances. One of the favorite things she did was kind of teleport cigarette papers. She was a tobacco addict. She smoked all the time. She was constantly smoking. Again, this is one of the things that was just remarkable about her. She was so transgressive. She broke the rules. She was this woman who was just smoking like a chimney all the time. But she would sort of transport her cigarette rolling papers to some place, and then someone would go there, and lo and behold, they would be there. Or a variety of other things. But one of the other sort of apports were the famous Mahatma letters. And this was not something that she did, but this is something that the masters did. And the masters communicated to her, and later on to Sinnett. They wrote these long letters. Some are in red ink and some are in blue, and actually copies of them are at the British Library here in London, and I've gone and examined them, and they're written out in eloquent handwriting, and in a very eloquent English too. That's an English that's very, very different than Blavatsky's own writing. It's really not like it at all. She kind of hammers away. She kind of pounds on the table, and she has an insistent thrust, and she is a hectoring kind of thing, which is it could be thrilling at times, but after a while it gets a little much. But this was a very eloquent, clear, what you would have called a BBC, British English later on, and these letters literally appeared out of nowhere. They would just kind of out of the sky or from the ceiling and float down, and they would be there. and many, many different reports of these sorts of things. And this was the sort of thing that she had learned how to do, and the masters somehow communicated in this way. These letters would appear, and they would have, instructions or kind of guidance or, spiritual teaching and that sort of thing. And as I say, if you're ever in London, you go to the British Library, you can check them out, and they're actually remarkable, artifacts to actually have and examine.
Mm-hmm. And they became quite controversial. She had a controversial life. I know you report that many writers have written books about her and vehemently disagree about basic facts of her life and about her character. Well.
There's books that are just character assassinations, and then there's books that are hagiographies. And as is the case with many of the spiritual teachers, that's what you usually get. You usually get, the hagiographies where she could do no wrong, everything she said is true, and the person goes to great lengths to try and, put everything together so it all, kind of works out without any problems. And then you have the character assassination, say she was a fraud, she was complete, she was a fake. She just sort of took advantage of everything. I mean, there were ones who were saying that she was somehow a prostitute wallowing in the flesh pots of Europe. And I mean, not to sound, I don't know how this would sound, but Madame Blavatsky was not a petite woman. She was a very large woman, and she, even when she was young, and she was quite, she had a very nice face when she was young, but she was still, rather ample. So the kind of, vision of her wallowing in the flesh pots of Europe seems a bit counterintuitive to me, and a variety of other things. And that's one of the reasons why I did my book. And in the beginning of the book, I referred to the American historian Jacques Barzin, who's a remarkable historian, and he lived 104 or something like that. But he has he writes about having the problem with writing about someone who's too well known. I mean, one thing you have is somebody who nobody knows about, and they should know about them, so you write about them and you introduce them. Then there's somebody who a lot of people know about, but they know about them wrong. What they know about is incorrect. And what you have to do is kind of cut through all of this layer of sort of this kind of the sort of accretion of misconceptions about them. And then you can kind of pull that away, and then, okay, I try to sort of do that in the story, not in the sense, in my book, not in the sense that I've got the facts, I've got the real truth, but I can say, well, actually, this account of her doesn't really hold up, this kind of thing. I mean, one of the things that was said about her, and which I know I'm guilty of, and I've repeated it in some things I've written, was that she smoked cannabis or marijuana. She smoked hashish constantly. Well, probably not at all, because in what she actually writes, she was teetotal, celibate, and as far as I know, was anti-drug. She probably experimented at some time early on in her career, because a lot of mediums did. A lot of spiritualists did. It put you in the mood, as it were. But the two accounts of her doing this, one was written early in her career by a friend, and it's a kind of puff piece in the sense that, look at this remarkably interesting character, and here's another interesting exotic thing she's done. She's been in Cairo and smoked hashish and blah blah blah. And later on, another article was written by a top spiritualist at the time who hated Madame Blavatsky because of what I said, because she was saying that the spiritualists just got it all wrong. And so went out of her way to bring up every possible thing that could have been, horrible about her. Even racial kind of attacks, saying she had negroid hair and things like that. And one of the bad things about her was that, she was a hashish addict. But probably not at all. But she certainly smoked tobacco enormously, and she was known to just leave ashes everywhere. And so people always kind of, she wasn't the acme of decorum. So if she was in someone's home, she was just leaving ashes and cigarette butts, everywhere, and things of that sort.
Mm-hmm. Well, she arrived in the United States in 1873 after having traveled the world and having had many, many adventures. And within 2 years of her arrival here, and as you point out, she was practically penniless when she arrived. She had met Colonel Alcott and other people, William Judge,
Judge, yeah.
They, three of them founded the Theosophical Society in 1875, but I'm under the impression that while she was in the United States, the society itself didn't really become a major movement.
Well, she had tried a couple things before.
Mm-hmm.
There was something called the Miracle Club that she had for a while, and she tried a different kind of. She wanted to get some kind of movement going, some kind of society going. There were a few different things. I forget the fellow's name, but he was a journalist in Boston, and a variety of different attempts to get something going. And they never really got any traction and went anywhere. And the spiritual sort of thing, in sense of being fresh and new and exciting, had its heyday. And she had the sense there was time for something new to happen. And it was at one of these get-togethers, and that she had with, as you said, Alcott and Judge and other people at the time that, were interested in this sort of things. And someone had given a lecture on sort of the ancient canon, the canon of proportions and measurements that the ancients used for the pyramids and things of that sort. And I think it was Judge or Alcott, I don't remember, but somebody had said, wouldn't it be interesting if we developed, a society that was based on studying this kind of thing? And they said, yeah, that's a great idea. And then they met next to sort of come up with the idea, well, not the idea, but the name of the thing. And they had different ideas for the names. And again, I forget who exactly, picked Theosophy, but this became the Theosophical Society. And Theosophy has a history going back to Christian spirituality. It comes out of Christian spirituality. It comes out of people like Jakob Boehme in the 16th century and even earlier. And it's the wisdom of God. It's knowing the wisdom of God. The old Christian Theosophist was a spiritual sort of practice to be able to meditate and be filled with that wisdom of God. Whereas from Blavatsky, Kwan, Judge, and Alcott's point of view, it was basically this kind of scholarly kind of study of these sorts of things, and also of anomalous phenomena, what we would call paranormal phenomena and that kind of thing. So it was kind of a scientific, scholarly pursuit and a practical one too. And they say, it's sort of there's no higher religion than truth. And their idea at the time was basically to bring kind of the truths of religion that had been lost, the truths of the ancient wisdom that had been lost. I mean, I said she started out very much pursuing the ancient Hermetic tradition. Mm-hmm. This became what she wrote in Isis Unveiled. But then, and with the rising science that was happening. But yes, the Theosophical Society itself, it attracted a lot of people. Thomas Edison, he's one of the well-known early members. A fellow named Abner Doubleday, who was a Civil War hero, and who people say invented baseball. There's some controversy about that. But she did attract some well-known people at the time, but it didn't sort of kick off into a kind of mass movement. And the thing that sort of got that going, as I just said, was her book Isis Unveiled, which came out about 2 years later in 1877, and actually was a bestseller when it came out.
Well, and let's talk about how she wrote that book. It's a massive book, and it was a bestseller, but it seems, I've tried to read it. I find it almost impenetrable.
No, it's a difficult book. Like I say, she has this thumping, hectoring style, and I couldn't read it straight through. I read quite a bit of it. I think if you take it in chunks, and it's interesting for a variety of reasons. I mean, one of the things is that it's one of the first books to present the ancient wisdom as something that is analogous to contemporary science. They're not opposites. They're not in conflict. They actually complement each other. So this is something like people like Daniken, something like people like Fritjof Capra, did later on. She's one of the first ones doing that. Also in that book, just in the sense of history of ideas, she actually presents the first philosophical argument against Darwin. Not a religious one, but basically taking on Darwin's ideas by themselves and looking at them philosophically, not to say that they're heretical or, they go against, church teaching. So she's she's the first one to do that, actually. I mean, the credit for that is usually given to Samuel Butler, who wrote Erewhon and The Way of All Flesh, but he also wrote a series of anti-Darwin books in the 1870s. But her Isis Unveiled came out in 77, and I think the first book of his like that came out in 78. So it has historical importance. And then basically what she's saying the ancients believe this is true knowledge, whatever it is, the Gnostics or the Hermeticists or the Rosicrucians, whoever it is, and here's some contemporary science that confirms this, or basically does that, and basically here's here's all the other attitude towards science which we need to change. It's too reductive and it's too narrow. And yeah, it's a tour de force because she brings together all this stuff. But as you say, how she actually wrote it, well, that's just Alcott tells of how, because they shared living quarters together in different places, and she was living in Hell's Kitchen in New York, in a place they called the Lamasery, or it came to be called the Lamasery because it was all done up in Eastern and Oriental and exotic kind of decor. And there's a famous story where she had a baboon, or a stuffed baboon, that was sort of done up as a kind of college professor sort of thing. And this was supposed to be kind of, T.H. Huxley or somebody like that, some real proponent of Darwinianism there. So she had an enormous sense of humor. She had a remarkable sense of humor, Blavatsky. She's one of these characters who, she's funny. Whatever you think of her, she's very, very funny. But when she was writing the book, she would sort of look out, into like the middle distance. And then, and as if she was reading something, and the idea that she was somehow astrally reading text. She didn't have all the books at her disposal. She had already read an enormous amount, so she had an incredible memory, or at least that's the account. But then she somehow was able to visualize seeing texts that, she didn't have on hand. And then she would ask people, can you go to the library, the New York Public Library, and check up, whatever it was and see if I'm right. And more times than not, the story was that she was right. But the other thing Alcott reports is that she would actually, her face would change. She would go through sort of physical changes in her whole appearance, and somehow her hair would be different, or her face would be different, and somehow she was embodying some of the sources of the wisdom she was writing about. Somehow she would kind of become them in some way. And there's a variety of different sort of again, anomalous sorts of experiences that took place in the course of the writing. But the publisher was absolutely flummoxed when he produced, I think, an edition of about 1,000 copies that sold out like immediately, and they actually was at pains to try and produce more copies because more people wanted it. And it got, a lot of bad reviews in the sense that it's just a rehash of a lot of other stuff. But some people actually got very, very good reviews, and it more or less established her. But again, this is one of the odd questions was after that, not too long after that, she decides to go to India. Mm-hmm. And it's why are you going to India now? And this was something that happened. And she went to India like very soon after she got U.S. citizenship. So actually, when she traveled to India, and then after that traveled through Europe and all that, she was a U.S. citizen. It's Russian origin, but she was a U.S. citizen living in India. Then she gets kicked out of India, basically. We'll get on to that. And then she spends her last days wandering through Europe, and then finally here in London.
So the headquarters of the Theosophical Society actually moved with her to India, I believe.
Oh, yeah. It finally wound up in Adyar, which is still there. But again, there's Theosophical Society in England. There's a Theosophical Society in America. There's a Theosophical Society. So over time, these things broke up, and there were, especially after Blavatsky died, there was a kind of struggle, for who's going to carry on, and this sadly usually happens in these kind of things. But for some reason, she and Alcott decided to join forces with this Hindu. It was like it was a Hindu nationalist group, and again, the idea was unavoidably sort of political concerns come into this, because one of the aspects of Hindu nationalism was to go back to their ancient traditions, to revive them. I tell the story in the book, and it's a little bit ahead, but during her last days here in London, one of the people who came to visit Madame Blavatsky was Gandhi. And Gandhi was here in London, and I say in talks he was doing his best to be Ben Kingsley, in the sense he was trying to be, an Englishman. He was brought up to be English, and he was sent from India to come and study, and he had the bowler and the umbrella and all this kind of thing. And the story is that he met two theosophists who were interested in him just because he was Indian, and they started up a conversation, and they had been reading a lot of Hindu literature and all that, and they said, "Oh my God, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to read the Bhagavad Gita in the original language?" And he had to admit that he had never read it in any language. He hadn't read it, it wasn't available to him. And they said, "Oh well, you must come with us." And they took him to meet Madame Blavatsky. And it was through meeting Blavatsky that Gandhi was introduced to his own tradition. And to his last day, I mean, he wrote about Theosophy as a positive force in the world in like the very day that he was assassinated. I mean, you can find it. So this was something that they were doing. I mean, they didn't start out necessarily being political, but it got into a political context because it was about, going back to the roots of the ancient tradition, of the old tradition there. So they got involved with the Indian group that was doing that there, and that's why they moved. Basically pulled up stakes and went to India. But soon after they were there, they realized that their purposes were different and they split apart. But it was when they got to India that the Theosophical Society really took off as an enormous mass movement.
You mean Olcott and Blavatsky?
Olcott and Blavatsky. I mean, some other people came with them, but they went there. I mean, Olcott himself became an incredibly influential and honored person it's Sri Lanka now, but in Ceylon. Again, he went there and he basically taught Buddhism to Buddhists. He brought Buddhism to people whose culture is Buddhist, but they didn't know anything about it because the Christian missionary, work was going on, and they were basically saying, "No, that's all superstitious stuff. You have to, read the Gospels and so on and so on." And in Colombo, there's a stamp, there's a train station, there's a variety of different sort of civic and national monuments to Olcott because he wrote a Buddhist catechism. He basically wrote a kind of textbook for people to learn Buddhism. So if you think about a Christian coming to England and they didn't know anything about Christianity and here we're going to teach you now. It's something along those lines. So they were both enormously loved in India too. And again, Blavatsky's always sort of tarred with this racism stuff because she talks about root races in her books, mostly in The Secret Doctrine. But she had, she didn't display any of that in her life. She didn't hang out with the Europeans who were there. She avoided the white people who were there. She basically went native and was living with the natives and all that kind of thing. And the white aristocracy or elite who were there, they were shocked at all this. It was like, and again, she's a Russian American citizen going camping out with the Hindu natives there. So it's a remarkable kind of, here's the brotherhood of man all in one big package in Madame Blavatsky.
And as I understand it, she and Olcott actually received a Buddhist initiation.
Apparently they were the first Europeans to convert to Buddhism. This is the story. I mean, it may have been earlier, but everything I've read, they were the first ones, and it was a big ceremony and all that. And actually, they were sort of brought around the country. They were taken to different places and all that. And this is how she got on the bad side of, the British, the Raj there, because she didn't care for them. She had, she didn't have anything good, or very little good to say about Christianity or the Judeo-Christian kind of tradition and all that. And she was basically there undermining the work of the missionaries and bringing, the ancient traditions, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Vedas, all, the Ramayana, all this kind of stuff to the people who they should have known this already. And so she got on their bad side. And so forces were there ready to find something they could use against her. And this is fundamentally what happens.
Well, while she was critical of the Judeo-Christian tradition, I understand that she also considered herself a very serious student of the Hebrew Kabbalah. Oh, yeah.
It's part of the hidden wisdom. It's part of this tradition. And this is something that today people talk about as the traditionalist school. We talked about this in one of the other interviews. People like René Guénon and then that, but it also goes back. It goes back to the Renaissance. It goes back to the rediscovery of the Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetic writings, and this whole idea of the perennial philosophy. And the idea was that back in ancient time there was a fundamental revelation of truth, and this disseminated out into the great religions, and you can find it in their heart. So, she was a student of Kabbalah, and she didn't have anything against sort of Jews themselves or Christians themselves. It was but she found it a very what do you want to call it? Restraining, repressive kind of teaching. But when she lived in Lower East Side, she was a seamstress. She worked, sewing for Jewish tailors and things of that sort. So, but this is the free thinking side of her. The argument she had against Judeo-Christian tradition are the same ones that people like William Blake had. He was a Christian, but he was very radical, eccentric, esoteric kind of Christian. Or later, people like Nietzsche, who was basically seeing the kind of Christianity, not the esoteric or the real Christianity, but the bourgeois, kind of complacent, lip-serving Christianity of Europe at the time as something that was a repressive influence. And this is the same thing that Blavatsky railed against.
You raised an interesting argument in your book, suggesting that at least some people think, or people around Blavatsky may have thought, that the rise of spiritualism as an enormous social fad in the 19th century in America and then throughout Europe and even into Latin America, that there were esoteric forces behind that it wasn't what it appeared to be.
Well, the idea is that at some point there was a committee, let's say, of higher masters or masters throughout the world, and Rudolf Steiner talks about this as well, and he's trying to understand what Blavatsky's place in this history, and the idea was that the rise of materialism, of scientific reductionism, and all that kind of thing was just moving on too quickly. It was dominating too much. And so something needed to be done in order to, stop it or hold it back. And you could say you had the conservative masters who were saying, well, we have to keep these teachings, special and secret. If we send them out into, the masses, they'll just get kind of, watered down and corrupted. And the more liberal or progressive saying, no, we just have to get the message out there. We have to do something so that people become aware that there's more to reality than just the material world and all that. And so the idea was that, okay, we'll do this. And the thing that they did was spiritualism. They somehow enabled it to happen, or facilitated it happen, or instigated it happening. And subsequently, everyone thought, well, actually, it didn't work. It was it was a mistake, and it kind of sent things in the wrong direction. And I guess Blavatsky's mission was to rectify that, was to come and sort of, steer things back on the track so that the West could become aware of this ancient wisdom and also the wisdom of the East, which says that there's much more to reality than just the material world. Mm-hmm.
Now, I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I guess it's time. It's time.
She did.
Yes, she certainly did. And I'm impressed just right now in our discussion, thinking here is a woman who, to my understanding, never had any, formal higher education, and yet wrote these very, very abstract scholarly books about mystical truths and drawing upon many, many cultures. But she did it not in the way that a highly educated scholar would do, but in almost, like a world traveler. And
during her travels, she wrote stories or accounts for Russian newspapers. She had a long relationship with one Russian news publisher who would publish her stuff and all that kind of thing. No, she was autodidact, and she just read a great deal. And as I said, when she discovered her grandfather's library, this was the way she went. So, no, she read an enormous amount. I mean, I'm saying she's up to date on everything at the time. That's another thing that makes Isis Unveiled an interesting book, is you can get an idea of what were people interested in at this time. There's this long section about the health benefits of blue glass. The idea of sunlight coming through blue glass, or any kind of light passing through blue glass, the light reaching your body had healing properties and all this kind of thing. And there's still something along those lines these days. There's a variety of different therapies that have to do with color and light and all that kind of thing. But this was something at the time. This is, she's writing at 1875, 76, something like that. It published 1877, so 1876 she's writing it and all that. So this was stuff that was in the news, and she's talking about stuff hot off the presses. She's talking about books that are just coming out and all that. So again, it provides a fantastic kind of snapshot, or actually collection of snapshot of what was on people's minds then? What was the popular concerns then? So she's very much, again, she's very much up to date in the moment, what's going on and all that kind of thing. Not the retiring type at all. She wasn't just secluded in her study. She was out there knocking about with everything all the time, and still managed to absorb an enormous amount of material and reproduce it, and give it back in a form that we might not find it as readable, but I think it was sort of, you get value for money. You get everything you want is here. It's all here, right here. And she sort of did that.
I guess we need to get into the investigation of Madame Blavatsky by the Society for Psychical Research.
Yeah, well, this is sort of her downfall, as it were. When she was in India, and the Mahatma letters are, falling out of the air, and actually, occasionally a master makes an appearance to, whatever, impress in some way or teach or whatever, the reason may be. And what happens is that this old acquaintance or old friend, Madame Blavatsky, Madame Kolum, whom she knew in Cairo as a fellow kind of medium or psychic, gets in touch with her. She's read about her success in the newspapers and all that kind of thing, and I think they were stuck in Colombo or something like that. She and her husband. And Madame Blavatsky was a soft touch in many ways. She was a Russian, very sentimental, very generous, very open, very trusting, very communal, all that kind of thing. And so she basically said, "Oh, come here." This Madame Colum was down and out. They didn't have any money. They didn't know what to do and all that kind of thing. So she said, "Oh, dear friend, why don't you come here and we'll find something for you to do." So Madame Colum and her husband go, and they became kind of, caretakers of sort of the headquarters and that kind of thing. But gradually, the idea is that she builds up a resentment against Blavatsky and builds up a resentment against the other members of the Theosophical Society there. They're not really included in that kind of thing. And she takes a story that everything Blavatsky is doing is just faked. It's a complete fraud. It's all invention. The Mahatma letters are coming through cracks in the floorboards, and the vision of the Kudhumi walking by is basically there's a kind of paper mache, figure that's kind of carried along by the window, and it looks like, oh, there he goes, that kind of thing. And so she takes this story to one of the Christian missionaries who are ready for anything they can get about Madame Blavatsky. They're ready for it, and they just publish all of her, all these accusations she makes and all this kind of thing, and it's the big expose and all this sort of stuff. And this happens just at the same time as the newly discovered, newly created Society for Psychical Research here in England. She's met them. She's come to London at some point. She has a famous story where she's here in London and meets various members of that. And they say, "We would love to investigate you. We'd love to come and basically corroborate your claims or the claims made about you." And basically they send a fellow named Richard Hodgson to India to do that. But when he arrives, Blavatsky isn't there. This whole scandal has erupted, and he never talks to her, and he never actually witnesses any of the manifestations. He's just getting all the reports, all the secondhand. Long story short, he comes to the conclusion that she's a remarkable character, but she's one of the most remarkable hucksters in history, and it's all fake and it's all a fraud, and most likely she's a Russian spy. And this was the time of the Great Game, if you remember Kim, Kipling's Kim. This is the time where Russia and Great Britain are in this kind of struggle for influence in India and in the Himalayas and all this kind of area. And his idea is that, she's spying on the British. That's why she's hanging out with Sinnott, and Sinnott is friends with, different sort of, British colonialist officials and things of that sort. And that's why, whatever. So the thing she's most outraged about is that she's accused of being a Russian spy in the end. She's been called a fake before. That doesn't bother her. But to be called a Russian spy is just like, this drives her mad. And she wants to go to court. She wants to have it out and all that. The Theosophical Society get a little cold feet about this. They say, well, look, HPB, as Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, as she was known, they basically say, look, if you take this to court, if you sue, Hodgson or whoever, if you sue the missionary newspaper that's printing all this muck about you, eventually you're going to be asked to produce the masters. You're going to be, where are they? Please, all you have to do is them to show up. That'll confirm everything. And that's the last thing she wants to do. She doesn't want to draw the masters into this whole mess and all that. So she becomes a martyr, and she decides to leave. She leaves India. She leaves. She doesn't leave the Theosophical Society, but she sort of leaves India. She leaves Adyar, and this is where she starts this. She becomes the wandering Jew in a way. She becomes the wandering madam. The interesting thing about the Society for Psychical Research's account is, I forget it was sometime in the 1980s. I forget the name of the fellow who did this, but he was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, and he went over Hodgson's account, and he just saw flaw after flaw after flaw, and circumstantial and surmise and a variety of different things. And what the Society for Psychical Research actually did was they withdrew it. They withdrew this account. They withdrew his report as unsubstantiated. So it doesn't mean that it was true what she did, but it meant that Hodgson's account calling her a fraud was actually flawed. And funny thing about Hodgson himself is that was one of his first cases. And one of the things the Society for Psychical Research was intent on doing was being more scientific than the scientists, because it had to prove to them that the stuff it was studying was real. So they went through incredible layers of fact checking and whatever and that kind of thing. And they were in many ways more interested in disproving it than actually proving it, because they wanted to show that we're not being taken in. So that was kind of his motivation in doing this. But then subsequently he became a convert. He was convinced by other studies and all that. So I say in the book that, well, in a way the jury's still out on whether, we all know it's incredible. We all know it's absolutely, fantastic, the sorts of things she claimed was claimed about her. But I think we still have to give it the benefit of the doubt, because this one investigation into her, supposed investigation into her, powers and abilities was actually considered flawed from the people who did it.
The Society for Psychical Research, as I recall, actually issued a formal apology to the Theosophical Society. And then later on they said, yes, we issued the apology. We did bad research, but that doesn't mean she didn't cheat.
Well, again, it doesn't, well, I guess she caught between a rock and a hard place. She's sort of like, well, okay, but I say in the book, there's other examples of this kind of teleport sort of thing, so a variety of different, mystics have claimed to have done it and that sort of thing. So it's not without precedent.
In fact,
again, it's,
viewers of this channel might be interested in the interview with Stanley Krippner on his study of the apports of a Brazilian medium known as Amir Amadin.
So again, it's there. So again, it's absolutely fantastic. But then that's precisely what she wanted to do. She wanted to challenge our ideas about what we accept as reality. And she said later on she refused later in life to do any kind of thing. She wouldn't manifest anything. She wouldn't, make any phenomena happen. She refused to do it and all that. And she actually disparaged all that kind of stuff. And as is in the ancient Hindu tradition, the cities and all the power, these are stuff that, this is stuff that'll happen along the way, but don't get too caught up in that, because that's not the real, that's not the real goal. This is sort of spiritual enlightenment. That's the real goal for her. And so she's just sort of stopped doing that kind of thing for a long time.
I think it's interesting that in the wake of Madame Blavatsky, there are even today a number of different spiritual organizations that claim to be receiving channeled messages from the very same hidden masters, Kuthumi and Moria and others that were associated with Blavatsky.
Well, this is the thing. It was kind of after her death, who's got the hotline, to the masters now. And this, Colonel Alcott said that he had some contact with them, but he never really claimed in that sort of, in the same way. And the two people who really more or less established or said they established contact with the masters was Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater. And Annie Besant, she doesn't particularly psychic. She didn't have sort of the same kind of abilities, but Leadbeater apparently, was able to. And they started reading the Akashic record, that kind of thing that, Blavatsky talks about in The Secret Doctrine. And it's this kind of imperishable record of everything that's happened in the cosmos. And if you develop your psychic abilities, you can read this. And this is something that Rudolf Steiner, claimed to be able to do as well. But again, with Besson and Leadbeater, they became these kind of ascended masters, and this is something Elizabeth Clare Prophet, later on in the 80s and 90s, claimed to do, and Saint Germain, and another one is Alice Bailey. She claimed to have contact with one of kind of the minor masters, Dwaj Kul. He makes an appearance, in the Blavatsky years, but not as much, and he kind of comes into the story more with her. And again, at the end of her days, Blavatsky said, they're real people. They're real people over there, the other side of the planet. They're not up there in the skies and all that kind of thing. But it just that kind of lost its power and the whole idea that you could. And again, she complained. It sounds like anybody can get in contact with the masters now. It just isn't like that. But the horse had already bolted, from the stable, as it were, and you couldn't kind of get it back. But yes, you have many people claiming this these days. And again, I would say, if you check what Blavatsky said, the masters said, and if you check what these other people are saying, they say, you can find a lot of things that are very, very different, and they're not on the same page, as it were, all the time, at least.
Today, the Theosophical Society, I believe in the United States, they are very small but active. They have, I think, 5,000 members, roughly, in the United States. But their influence, going, back 100 years is just vast. It's hard to find a spiritual organization anywhere that hasn't been somehow influenced by Theosophy.
And not only that, one of the things I point out in the book is the avocado was introduced into the California agricultural system by Theosophists. There was a Theosophical. It's still, I suspect it's still there outside of San Diego. There was a woman named Catherine Tingley. One of the things I should say is Theosophy and Theosophical Society has produced a lot of women spiritual guides. The men are not quite as powerful in it, and the ones who are powerful have broken away and done their own thing, like Steiner. They tend to take a back seat. They tend to be supportive of the women teachers, as Alcott was of Blavatsky. But Kathleen Tingley was an American theosophist who went off in Point Loma of San Diego and set up a whole sort of theosophical estate there. Buildings like, I think she based a lot of them on sort of ancient Hindu structures and things of that sort. But one of the things they did was introduce the avocado into the California diet. And you think everybody in California has been eating avocados now for years and years and years and years. They have the Theosophical Society to thank for it. I mean, that's one thing, which is, it sounds funny, but that shows you how practical and how kind of concrete the influence was. It's
emblematic, I suppose, of their influence overall. Well, Gary, once again, this has been a fascinating discussion. I know we could keep going for another hour about Madame Blavatsky and all of her intrigues and her vast influence, but I'm very happy that we've covered most of the highlights, I think, of her life at this point. So once again, thank you for being with me. And
absolutely, my pleasure.
And once again, I look forward to doing more with you as well. I know we haven't even covered a small fraction yet of your writings. So,
well, as always, Jeffrey, I look forward to speaking with you again too.
Thank you so much, Gary.
My pleasure.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.